There we go. Now I'll really blow your ears out. So worked on high yield systems, and then a lot of what we've been working on lately is the residue management. And why we titled this With Biology, because biology is what degrades our residues. But today's systems have evolved quite a bit. We have a lot of residue, and maybe we're asking our soils to cycle more than they're used to. And what I've been working on is different management tools to try and help that system do it a little faster. And I'll go through some case examples today. A few of the things we're doing with approaches. Now, it's not every possible approach. Heard a lot of good things throughout the day about different ways to manage it. And I'll just start right off the bat. I don't have all the answers today, but if I did, I guess I wouldn't have a job. So happy to hear back from you as well, feedback, things we should be trying as part of an extension program, making sure the projects make sense for you. What I do like to talk about, though, when we start, let's see, got a clicker? Do I have to point this a certain way? There we go. Yeah, all right. So how do you traditionally think about crop nutrition? When we take our basic agronomy courses, we know that there's a lot of nutrition in the soil, and there's a lot of nutrition through fertilizer. And the way that these systems work is they go back and forth. We know our soil can become fertilizer available, and we know our fertilizer can sometimes get tied back to the soil. And what we understand about this is that things like plants and microbes drive these interactions back and forth, root exit. It's a communication and a pathway. What do we call the type of science that integrates the soil science with the plant science? That is agronomy. That's why we call ourselves agronomists. What's changing and what's getting really exciting is we're really good at the top half of that equation. We are pretty good at understanding the plants. New technologies, new tools, we're getting better at understanding the microbes. When we learn about microbes in soil science, what do we usually learn about? All right, Nitrosomonas nitrobacter, they move nitrogen. And that's pretty much all we talk about. The other time we talk about microbes in agronomy is the pathogens. There's a lot more microbes out there than just those that move nitrogen back and forth. We're getting a better understanding about this, and that is bringing a new system to light that's shifting us towards these biology versus chemical-based systems. Now, everything in life, has gradients. If I say an entirely biology-based system would be how some may define truly regenerative, no inputs, the system is sustaining itself. That would be entirely biology-based. And then a lot of the fields that I'm from in East Central Champaign County are very, very much chemistry-based. Multiple herbicide programs, fertility out every year, tillage practice. So that's the shift, though. There's a lot of things driving this shift. One, soil health is coming up. That's an important thing we're discussing, we're learning more about. The consumers, they don't understand it as well as maybe we do, but they know or like the idea of biology versus chemistry. So consumer demand is coming through. So a lot of times I talk to farmers and they say, well, I'm not really as interested in going down this biology-based route. I say, but those buying your products are, and that's going to drive it as well. So there's a lot of things moving on this, and it's an exciting place to be. So we go through, and that's a new shift. Where I like to position it then specifically is the residue interplay and what that's coming from. Cover crops, we heard a lot about that on the panel. It's been a couple topics today, right? There's the physical evidence, photo evidence of the residue, but it's also in a no-till scenario. So you got corn stalks is there. Double cropping, I know we're in the northern area, but it's making a comeback. We heard the jokes earlier, well, last year or a couple years ago at the conference was a snowblower, now it's a lawnmower. Must be warming up. Pros and cons to that, but one of the pros is the double crop opportunity is moving north. That's more residue to deal with. And like I said earlier, I work with a lot of farmers that are conventional tillage in East Central Champaign County, not no-till, no cover crops, just corn, beans, fallow in the winter. And they say, why should I be talking to you about residue? And I simply say, have your yields gone up? Yields, higher yields is more residue. Just how much? So here is a graph. You got grain yield in corn bushels on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the stover accumulation. It's very constrained ratio. We are not growing more grain on the same amount of vegetative biomass. If we have more grain, we got more leaf material, more stalk material. That's about 52% harvest index. So 50% of the plant is grain, 50% is vegetation. That ratio we have not changed. So more yield is more stover. And in fact, if you do that math, one more bushel of corn going in the bin is 44 pounds of dry matter going out the back of the combine. Now, 44 pounds doesn't seem like much per acre, straw bale. But then you start doing the math. Have your on-farm yields gone up 10 bushels in the last 5 years? Now you have almost 440 pounds of residue you're trying to manage that you didn't used to. Has the family farm yields gone up 20 bushels? Now we're almost 1,000 more pounds of residue. So suddenly the residue discussion becomes relevant to no matter which type of farm you're on if your yields are going up. So what do you call that stuff? I've been calling it residue, right? Is residue a really nice term? Think about residue, it's what's left on the sink right after you wash the dishes or something, not maybe a friendly term. Stover is that's the scientific term. I don't know about you, sounds like a bad cheese to me, stover. All right, is that a good name for it? I hear this last one all too often though, right? So you got those two little wheels at the front of the planter. What do a lot of folks call those? Trash whippers. Breaks my heart every time. Is that really trash or is it treasure? That's the question behind residues, trash or treasure. Why do we call it trash? That's not a good day, is it? Nope. I actually got to give credit to where credit's due on this. Marion Kalmer has sponsored this conference, and that is his photo. So we appreciate using his photo. It's a great example. Trash, run into this on a research planner, makes our situations in the springtime sometimes a little troublesome. And that's where that comes from. But then I like to be optimistic on the treasure side, and that's the nutritional value of that residue. Just how much nutrition is in that residue? Now, this varies a little bit. When did you sample? Who sampled it? What was the year? But these are ballpark numbers you can be pretty confident in. This is for a 230 bushel corn crop. And you're going to have about 108 pounds of nitrogen out there, 21 pounds equivalent of P2O5, and 122 equivalent of K2O. That is all in that residue the day that you harvest that year's crop, going out the back end. The problem with treasure is if treasure was easy to find, we'd all be rich, right? Treasure, think about pirates. Usually it's some journey to get to it, hide it, protect it. Treasure is not an easy thing to get to. And so we want to think, how do we get there? And I use this analogy: reduce, reuse, recycle. I'm pretty sure all of us recognize this symbol, right? Junior high, high school, how many of us were dragged into an auditorium for a guest speaker to teach us about the value of this? I could still sing today the little lyric they taught us to remember this. Don't worry, for your sakes, I will not sing that back to you today. But I like it because it makes an analogy for residue recycling as well. So you can minimize your waste, you can reuse it 2 times or more, and then you're going to recycle it for a new purpose. Rebranding this to our perspective on today's discussion reduces residue degradation. Now, that's not less residue. Less residue might imply you had lower yields, right? So after the residue's in the field, we want it to grade faster. Reusing it is that nutrient value, the treasure, and then recycle to me is an improvement in yield if we can get there, or maybe that's relying less on other inputs and you can get the win there as well. And that's the crop physiology rebrand of reduce, reuse, recycle on your residues. Why this is so important is because of the C to N ratio. This is why the treasure is not so easy to get to. Source dependent. What I mean by that is different vegetation has different C to N ratios. Soil microbes ballpark like this 24-1. They have a biomass natural of 8-1. And then if you do the chemistry background on how much energy it takes to maintain that, it's 16 carbons. So you need 8 to maintain your biomass, 16 to do that, 24 total, 24-1 is the ratio that they like. And if you are above that, you induce nitrogen mineralization, as we're going to eat nitrogen up as we break and get into the carbon. But if you're below that, you're releasing more nitrogen than you need as you take that carbon and sequester it. So that's actually going to be mineralization. And this is where common C to N ratios come into play. So you got your rye or your wheat straw. This assumes all the way to harvest to physiological maturity. So it's dry and dead. You got your corn stover there. That's equivalent to what I just talked about going out the back end. Then if you terminate early on the rye, right? So if it hasn't gone all the way through grain fill and put seed out, it'll have a lower C to N ratio. And then we get into the ones that induce that mineralization, that alfalfa, the clover, hairy vetch, and then at the bottom, of course, is the microbes. So if you're up top, you're inducing immobilization. And if you're down low, you're inducing mineralization. This is where some people talk back and forth about some of the benefits of mixed cover crop species. Because if your cereal rye gets too far and goes above 24-1, Now you have a nitrogen problem. But if you can counter that with something that maybe is like a vetch, a clover, a pea, that might balance it, and your average of the residues is closer to that 24-1. So this is where different things like mixes come into play. And then we talk a lot on corn stover because that's probably the most consistent across all the room. If you got corn acres, you got this. You can have different cover crop species, you can have different things in rotation, but corn stover is a common enemy or treasure, right? Best friend, however you want to spin it. Hopefully after today, it is your best friend. We've taught you how to manage it. But one of the things, seed-end ratio, by show of hands, we've all heard before, right? It's not an unfamiliar topic. There are other nutrients in residue as well, though, not just nitrogen. We don't talk about C to P ratios, C to S ratios. You know what the C to S ratio is? Almost 350-1. So we know that if you're above that 24-1, it's not the best day for nutrient availability. Sulfur's got an uphill battle. And this is why I'll just preface today, all the work we've been doing has had a sulfur component because we're trying to tackle the C to N and the C to S ratios at the same time. Maybe we could just look at nitrogen, but it's a reason to think about sulfur as well in high residue systems. I think that often gets overlooked. So how do you manage the residue? We like sizing the residues, chopping them up, right? If I put a steak in front of you and you just grab it and take a big bite out of it, right? Some of us will do that. Most of us take a knife and fork and cut it up, make it easier to chew. That's like making the steak easier for the microbes to chew. Like I said, the microbes in your soils, the ones you already have, do this job. Just make it a little easier for them to do so. Some of us, though, don't like just a plain steak on the grill with nothing else, right? A little salt and pepper can go a long way when you're cooking. This is where we're doing things like a little bit of nitrogen and sulfur. It's like salt and pepper to the residues, make it more palatable for the microbes. Now, this is not fertilizer rates necessarily for next year's crop. This is thinking of nitrogen and sulfur fertility as a residue management tool. And then the last thing, this is the new market. We're going to talk a little bit about this and a little later in the presentation is why not spray it with a biological to go after residue decomposition. The three different tools of mechanical, chemical, or biological for residue decomposition. So I'm going to show you a few examples on some extreme cases because in research, we sometimes start at the extreme side, figure out what maybe has the best potential, and then work it to more real-world applied scenarios. So there's a long-term site. This one was established in 2004. So there's two sister sites. The other one was established a year before this. And when Allison Vogel got to work on this with Dr. Bilo, she worked on it in 2017 when it was 15th year continuous corn. And so she looked at long-term continuous corn yield penalty at things like sizing, ammonium sulfate, and then a biological. There's just the visual, why continuous corn can be a problem. Again, C to N ratio, repeat 57-1 year after year after year. There's the nitrogen deficiency. It's why we typically recommend 20 to 30 more units of N on continuous corn versus rotated ground. But if we could get that residue to release it faster, can we get the left side to look more like the right side through management? And so here is the average across a couple different things she was doing, different managements and hybrids. But this is the value of sizing the residue on either continuous corn up top or corn soybean down below. And you can see that sizing it was worth 4 or 5 bushels. Now that's not a huge response, but in corn yield world, 4 to 5 bushels, still notable. And remembering on the mechanical side, that's a big purchase, expensive purchase up front, but then you get that value to pay back over years. Whereas the other inputs we'll talk about are you got to pay for those each year. So just starting to think the economics. So in this scenario, it was worth 4 or 5 bushels. But the key thing here is the difference between rotation was a 33 bushel penalty. Now, some folks say if you do continuous corn after 5 years, the penalty goes away. In this work, we see that the penalty continues to go, and it's up to 33 bushels of unmanaged control plot type approach after 15 years of continuous corn. So that's a big penalty to manage, and can we get some of that back? That's where we look at things like maybe an untreated control in UTC. Extract was a microbial extract. The idea here is just put some metabolites out, goodies, sugars, amino acids, no living microbe, but give the tools or the food they like to then stimulate them to go after the residue, and then just broadcast ammonium sulfate. This was 200 pound acre rate, so about 48 pounds of sulfur, 42 pounds of N in the fall. These are all fall treated. So there's those yields. So in this case, Allison had a huge response to that extract. on average across those two, it was worth about 20 bushels. That's the highest I have seen. So we do have that data, and this is published. She looked at it. A 20 bushel response to a fall applied biostimulant for residue decomposition is huge, but she did see that here. And then the ammonium sulfate in this case was worth 5 bushels. So biological-based biostimulant product or just fertility, helping get a little bit more advantage. And then what she found is as you added those, it tended to get better. And so that's her preliminary work, where she first started just looking, how do we manage these long-term scenarios? Sizing seems to work. Biostimulants seems to be really working here, and then ammonium sulfate. One of the cool things about these long-term sites, they have a history. So I mentioned I work with Dr. Fred Bealow. I mentioned him for a reason, because he started these sites in, like I said, 2003, 2004, the two sister sites that we work on. Allison got to work on for a while, or someone before her. So I took over after Allison. So she did these in 17 and 18. I worked on it in 2019, 2020. So it's always kind of fun. Where was I when this site was established? Well, I am from Northern Illinois, and anyone that's been over there might know Edwards Apple Orchard. So there was me in 2003 when they established that site. So it's kind of just a funny little look back when you get to work on these legacy sites and think, where was I? And apparently, though, I did know I wanted to be a corn agronomist someday. So that's me when that site started. And then I got to work on it again, like I said, 2020 and 2021, when it was now 19th or 21st year continuous corn. Like I said, depends on which block you're on based on that long term. But this is more than 15. What I looked at also made it worse was no-till. I said, let's go to the extreme. Let's take that 19 and 21 years of continuous corn and make it no-till. Allison's penalty was 33 bushels. My penalty was 48. Now, this is long-term, unmanaged research control. This shows if you do continuous corn without any change between the rotations, what you could expect. For those of you in the room that are doing continuous corn, you know you don't do that. Right? You manage continuous corn to avoid this penalty. So this is the worst case scenario. What happens when we start stacking these managements? We added the super choppers, really sized the residues up. That was worth 13 bushels in the no-till scenario. This is the average of 2 years that we did this work. Adding the ammonium sulfate on top of that gave another 1 bushel. If you wanted to not have the sized residue and just spread the AMS, that was worth 8 bushels. So if you're looking at one or the other, AMS alone was 8, but if you put them together, it's that 14 if you add those up. And this is where things started to get interesting. We applied a living microbial blend on top of that. And I got another 11 bushels, and when you stack them all together, that's 25, and that's a 52% reduction in the continuous corn yield penalty. What I want the take-home message of this data to be, and the idea, how much do you think that biological in the jug was worth if I just sprayed that without sizing residues or without any ammonium sulfate? It was worth 4. And that product, that's borderline paying for the application cost at that time. And so the idea, what we see, is the biologicals are the next step. So first size it, let the natural microbes do their thing. Give them a little bit of fertility, it'll go a little further. And then the biologicals might be a third step if you're looking to that system. But we did see that any 2- or 3-way combination was better than any one by itself. So the systems approaches, I think, are key to residue when we start managing it. So the key that we like to think about, nitrogen and sulfur fertility, whether that's through AMS or maybe it's through poultry litter, it improves the decomposition and the grain yields. And this is the reminder to everyone in the room, the microbes need nutrients too. When microbes go after residue, it's carbon heavy, but they need nutrition just like plants do. There's a reason plants need nutrients. There's a reason we need nutrients. Microbes need them as well. So also thinking about fertility, fertilizing the crop, but also fertilizing the microbes so they can continue to act on your behalf. So that's a key important message I think that might get overlooked. We sometimes hear fertility is bad for soil microbes. Fertilizers help decrease the soil biology. Every situation is different and unique, but we've done some work now where we've been putting starter in furrow and then pulling soil samples 3, 20, 40 days after starter application. Biological activity is going up in that root zone because we gave them a little nitrogen and gave them a little phosphorus and they're cycling that. Now this is in higher carbon organic matter 4% soils. So there's enough soil maybe to buffer that. Maybe we'd see something different in a 1.5 or a 2%. But the idea that fertilizer is directly bad for soil communities is not a universal thing. And we tend to see in our 3 to 4% organic matter, it actually stimulates microbial activity for this reason here. So we want to then kind of think if it is the microbes, we hear about rotations in microbial communities. We did some sampling last few years on these two sites. What you have here is bacterial diversity, and there's a lot going on. I know you can't read the legend. The key thing here is different colors are different types of microbes. Within each left to right of panel is continuous corn or corn soy, and then on the other side is site 2, continuous corn or corn soy. The key thing here is if you look at these, they're almost the same. What surprised us in this work is that after 20 years on average of continuous cropping, there was no difference between the rotations. The biggest difference was the sites. And these sites have been managed identically for the last 20 years. So a lot of what's in the microbial community is what was there to begin with. So we didn't change bacterial communities because those are really, really similar in that regard. But what about the fungal communities? And this is where things get interesting. So the site A is the left and site B is the right. First thing you'll notice is site B has almost no fungal activity in it. Each of those bars, there's barely any individuals. And on the other site, a lot of different colors, a lot of bars means a lot of different individuals. It's like a five-fold difference between my fungal diversity. But if you really focus in on that first site, there was a threefold abundance under the continuous corn. And then the site B had different OTUs or taxonomic units, so it really didn't matter. But the key point here is long-term continuous corn had greater diversity than rotated corn soy for fungal. And if bar charts and visuals aren't your thing and you like numbers, here's the numbers. So this is the number of taxonomic units for the average of the corn soy or the continuous corn, and then the fungal. And if you look, no change in bacteria. Continuous corn had 16% greater fungal diversity than corn soy. And that goes counterintuitive to what we sometimes hear, right? Better crop rotation should be better for microbial communities. Again, like I said, a lot of these stories and different inferences are very site specific. But what I know is going on here is continuous corn and continuous corn and continuous corn is a lot of residue and residue and residue. Which microbes in your soil are really good at breaking down residue? It's the fungi that do the bulk of the work. Bacteria are cool, but they're a little lazy. They go for the easy sugars. The fungi go after the hard to break down residues. So in this case, I think the system adapted to be going after the residues. So I think sometimes it's, should we try to change the community that we have, or just understand the community we have and then help manage them to be more effective at their jobs? So that's kind of the perspective I like to bring, thinking microbes and soils and how to work with them. It's their function, not necessarily who's there, but how are they doing it, and we help them do that job more efficiently. So an example where continuous cropping had better diversity on the fungal side. So that's continuous corn. I mean, we can pause if there's any questions on continuous corn, a few of the long-term examples, but how many of you are in 20 plus years of continuous corn, right? Different systems. Guess question in the back. So the question is, did we look at other biological species like actinomycetes? We did not. We did not look at those. We didn't do any earthworm counts either. So definitely other things you can measure. So in this case, we are restricted to just total bacterial fungal. Yep. So, Yep. So the comment is that actinomycetes can maybe hinder the bacterial communities, but in this case, they'd probably be hindering them equally because there was no difference on the bacteria, but could be interesting if there's more on one rotation or the other, and that's keeping it balanced. So there are always a lot of things to look at. And it's a good point too. How we measure what we measure has a lot to tell for the story. And so also being careful that we don't get too focused on things as well. So we did want to look then at cover crop systems, and we start with CORI. Keep an eye on my time here. What we've seen with that, so this is now no-till cover crop. You got corn stover, and we terminated vegetative, so we went pretty early. You can see that's actually the stage where we terminated, so we didn't get let too far. Do these approaches work in cover crop systems? Because like I said, the long-term continuous corn is cool for a researcher. Not many folks are 20 plus years continuous corn in that scenario. This is more realistic. So how do we apply these? And this is through the Illinois Nutrient Resource Education Council. So we first look at on the corn side, before we drilled our cereal rye, how does sizing the corn residue impact cover crop establishment, good or bad? So there's just a more close-up visual on the sizing. This is something, as a researcher, you look at things, we thought, maybe sizing would be better so that the drill could get in a little bit better ground contact. That creates a mat. And we'll talk later, that maybe hinders ability to get that cover crop off versus the standard. So that was first question. Does harvest method affect your cover crop establishment? And then do biological treatments or sulfur enhance the residue decomposition? One of the very different things between corn stover and cover crops is the timeline we're working with. Why do I think that relying on the nutrition value of the corn stalks for next year's crop might be feasible? Because it's got 6 months between harvest and when you go plant the next crop, and then another 3 months over the summer to release that nutrition. On the cover crops, especially if you're planting green, you're hoping they'll release those nutrients in a much shorter window, just 3 months. Now you got the advantage, it's the peak summer, when you got the heat and the moisture, but do they release it fast enough for this year's crop? That's the question, and can we enhance that? So then we, in this case, did none or cereal rye. There's a bump there. We looked then at the sulfur. Now, the AMS and the continuous corn work was fall broadcast, but that's another application cost if you're paying for the floater, right? So the idea is maybe it goes out with your P and your K. Can we add something liquid with the termination pass? So it's all one application. So that's ATS, ammonium thiosulfate, thiazole. We're using a 120026. We're doing 20 pounds of sulfur, that's 7 gallons for those that are looking at ATS. Back to the C to N ratios, and then we are looking at different biologicals because that's where a lot of the market's going. And so what are biologicals? I've spent a lot of time in this space, still working on it, trying to figure out, but we can overgeneralize them into 2 different categories, beneficial microbes or biostimulants. If I oversimplify this, it's the living and the dead. And some people go, well, it seems obvious. If you're working with these products, though, that's a very important thing to remember, isn't it? Most of the inputs we're used to working with are fertilizers or chemistries that come to the shop, and they either go in the corner, into the bin, or on the shelf. Now we have living inputs. Seed is a living input. So we know we can't treat seed just like we do the fertilizer, but it's a little less delicate. You have a living thing come to your door. Now you are responsible for keeping it alive. There's a lot of questions with that. Did the truck driver keep it alive? Did the warehouse manager keep it alive? Did they keep it alive from where they fermented the microbes and bottled them to the warehouse down the chain? So there's a lot in this space yet to be figured out. I think it's exciting, and moving forward, there'll be some new options, those that are less easy to kill, but are we ready for it? I love working with the ones that need refrigeration. We had to buy a refrigerator on the research farm to be able to work with the living microbes. If you want to make conversation with the neighbor, invite them over to the farm, right? Why do I love going to the farm? Because you go to the farm on a rainy day and you go into the shop, there's usually the beer fridge. If you want to invite the neighbor over and say, go grab a beer out of the fridge, and they open it up, there's microbes, you'll get the conversation going pretty quick, right? But is the future a beer fridge and a biological fridge in the shop? I don't know. Probably not. Logistics wise, those that don't need refrigeration will probably win the market. But it's just a whole new topic of conversation, an interesting input area. And I want to focus on this a little bit because it's growing fast. So we've been doing biostimulant biological trials for 11 years now. So here's the different years. You got corn or soybean. That's pretty well what we've done. We're starting to get into wheat as it's moved north. I'm going to put a line here between 2016 and 17. So this is from the crop physiology lab. That's Dr. Belo's program. I joined him as a master's student in 2017. So we kindly refer to those first 3 years as 1, 2, and 3 BC before Connor. And then afterwards, are we doing more biological trials because I joined the program or because that's where the market is? Especially, just look at the last 5 years. It's a huge market that's growing, and it's growing really fast. So I like to put it in the context of country music because most of us can get along with country music. C.W. McCall's Convoy. In 2015, I would call the biological market little old Convoy. Why? Biologicals themselves are not new. Anyone here used a soybean inoculant? That often gets ignored from the biologicals discussion. Soybean inoculant is a biological. It's probably the original biological. Humic and fulvics have been around for decades here and there, just not maybe at the scale we see them today. So I would say in 2015, there was a little old convoy of biologicals, biostimulants. 2019 was a great big convoy. What's the significance of 2019? Pivot Bio first launched. That was the year they launched. And suddenly the biological market gates flooded open. So 2021, it was mighty convoy, and I'd say that in 2023, they crashed the gate to a 98, let those products roll. Because how many of you have seen this diagram? Like I said, you don't want to see a slide from a presenter on something you can't see. Don't worry for those in the front row. Even I can't tell you what's there from right here. But every little blur on there is a company logo. And that company was identified by this survey as being in the ag biologicals landscape. Now, that bottom left side is in biostimulants, inoculants, and biofertilizers. That top right is biopesticides. Very different conversation. That's all we're going to say on that today. But it's a huge market. Now, most people, when I've seen them use this slide, stop here. These are all the companies working in biologicals. How many companies do you know sell one product? Imagine if we remade this graph with all the products that you have the option to purchase. It gets big fast. A lot of that's because there's not much regulation on that, but it's a growing market that's coming to your door probably every day, and it's driven by this, the idea of a biology-based system, because like I said, the public loves the idea of this stuff. Consumer demand is going to drive it, and that's where it's coming from. So I was curious, after working with these things, what do these microbes do? And this is based on reading the label. And so that inner circle is the most common types. So if I read the label, I surveyed 155 products this last summer that were purely labeled for corn, wheat, or soy. I wanted to focus on the row crop market. I did not look at specialty crops. 155 products, 82% were nutrition-based. So I've read the jug, it should do something for my nutrient management. 9% was residue management. I'm kicking myself for not putting the year of release on this list. I bet that has been the last 2 to 3 years that's grown the most. 5% are plant growth, and then 3% soil inoculants or drought tolerance on 1%. Those that want to know what about the biostimulants, you could probably invert that list. So if you have a biostimulant, it's probably drought tolerant related, and then very few biostimulants are directly crop nutrition. So that's what these products are marketed to do based on reading the jug. How many different microbial species do you think I identified when I surveyed these? Remembering that the microbial species is the active ingredient. So how many active ingredients among 155 different products? There they are. 139, I'll sum it up for you. Active ingredients from those 155 products. Can you imagine if we came out with 155 new herbicides in the last 10 years and 139 new herbicide actives? The market is out of control. So then we have to try and do our best to filter through what might be the good or the bad. Like I said, it's exciting where it's going from, but it's a little overwhelming at times. But if you look at, here's the top 10, because a lot of those are one-off. One product has that one microbe. Here's the top 10 of those products, and you'll notice on there, number 4 is Bradyrhizobium. I did not exclude soybean inoculants from the survey because it is in the biological category from a regulatory perspective. And you can see there's a lot of bacillus on there and the azospirillums and azotobacter. So if the azospirillum and the azotobacter, those are typically nitrogen fixation. So if those are the active ingredient, the jug better say something about that. If it doesn't, does the company understand their microbes? Might be red flag, things like that. And then the bacillus seem to be more common. And I want to focus on those because the bacillus are what I see in the residue management space. Now we've gone full circle on that little tangent into the biological review to why I ended up with a living blend or a carbon blend in my studies here. We did want to pick a product that was representative of the market. And so on the left is the living, and you can see 5 of these were in my top 10 list. So we just picked a product that represented the broader market. Now this is if you want to pay for microbes in a jug and apply it to your farm. You know how many times I get questions from producers and they say, why would I buy a biological microbe if I've got billions of them in my soil? I say, that's a great question. You know, why not just stimulate the ones I've already got? That's the idea then of a biostimulant. Sugar and humic acid. Why we blended these two products together. Sugar, it's like giving candy to a kid, right? Immediate energy rush. They go off, but then what do? They crash. As soon as that sugar's burned through, their energy's gone. So then we got to give them whole wheat bread and a slow release carb to maintain the energy. So that's the concept, the idea here. Little sugar with a little bit of a complex carb to get the microbes going. When they burn through that and they're hungry and they're going, where do they go next? Your residues is the idea. So that's why you might think, should we just apply microbes to the residues directly or the carbon source to stimulate them? Now, I can think why this might be logical to pay for a biological and spray it. Thinking in a no-till scenario, that residue goes out, sits on the surface. Where are the microbes that do the residue decomposition? They're in the soil. So unless you get a really good pounding rain that puts soil on top of the residues, The idea here is you're just putting microbes there right at the job site. It's like a free Uber lift to get to work. So that's the concept as to why you might choose a living versus a non-living. We look at both so we can compare them. One example here, there's a lot of products that we could work with. So this is a 4-year static plot, meaning we're going to go back year after year and do the same treatments. I think a lot of research overlooks that value, but the long-term plots that are out there are too long-term. 20 years of continuous corn, our University of Marl plots are really cool, but after 120 plus years of rotation, I think a lot of that's just more for understanding some basics. But so 4-year study, we think is more of a transition side. So we took a conventional field, converted it to no-till cover crop, and then started managing it. So here's the first 2 years of what that looks like. So we had corn, we sized it with the different choppers. We drilled cereal rye in the fall, followed that in the spring with soybean. After soybean, we did a crimson clover tillage radish mix. And then this last year, we put corn into that in the spring. And then we're going to repeat this so the cereal rye is back out last fall and get to the 4 years. So what I have for you today is our halfway point. So what I can show you is what we've learned in the first year. And here's just some details for those that are interested. So that cover crop, we got it out a little late, but it was drilled October 21st. We put out 75 pounds of cereal rye. We terminated on the 24th of April, and then we came back about 3 weeks later. There was some rain. We couldn't quite plant immediately after, and then just some different notes there on the variety. And then we harvested on October 9th, which is important for how soon do you get the next cover crop in. So there's just some of the basics, and there's the soil test data where I think it's important to note we started this on a 5% organic matter soil. That's pretty high. And I know that's not as many folks, and it might say, why didn't you start on a 1.5 or 2%? We are curious to know if you already have high organic matter soils, can we keep pushing it, or does it relate? And so this is the site we have. So good P and K, and we're not putting out any more P and K after this for the 4-year study. So it's a good starting point. What happens? So then we go out, we sample, and we do the decomposition, and we do different times and collections to track the residue decomposition. How is it releasing? When is it releasing? What's the nutrient availability? Here, though, goes back to my first question. How does sizing the residues impact cover crop establishment? And you can see here, there was actually a statistical loss in biomass, which I'll tell you 2 tons, 4,000 pounds is pretty hot. If you go to the weed science side, though, we're right on the cusp of being perfect for weed control. So trying to find that balance. But again, like I said, I think when we sized it, we created a little map. Maybe the drill didn't get through as well. We didn't get as good of a total stand. Just an anecdotal note there. But then what do our treatments look like? And we saw very similar response to the other treatments, whether we sized or not. So moving forward, I'll show you the average of those value treatments over the chopping or not. But before we get there, we got to know how much residue or value was in that residue. So in that 2 tons was almost 88 pounds of N, 33 pounds of P2O equivalent, or 153 K2O. Now these values are out there, different times. Like I said, when did you sample? How did you sample might change them. But these are ballpark what you might expect the day you terminate. And what's really interesting is if you look at how much nutrition you need to produce an 80 bushel soybean crop in our area, that's a good target. That's the amount of nutrients required to produce and how much was in that cover crop. So in theory, 80 bushels, 27% of my nitrogen was in that cover crop, almost 60% of my P, and 67% of my K. But again, back to the challenge. Treasure, it's not readily available. That would assume all of those nutrients were plant available today. Our job is to try and get more of those to release. And if I can even get 1/3 of those to release, that's a pretty good day. So that's why we're going after these types of residue managements. Here's the effect on decomposition of the sulfur. And this is an important note I wanted to maybe bring to you if anyone's tried this, but some anecdotal things we've learned. So if you look at the R3 soybean, pick up the bags. This is like 60 days after we terminated. And then we went out at R7 just prior to full harvest. What's the total decomposition? And you'll notice ATS reduces the decomposition. In this scenario, we want a higher number. That means more of it decomposed, more of it broke down. So the sulfur in this case did not necessarily impact our residue decomposition. If anything, it delayed it. And that's because it looks like this the day after you plant it or spray it. This is 24 hours after that application. Which of those looks healthier? It's the one on the right. I use the analogy, if I'm going to give you an apple, and you have your choice of apples, and one of them's bruised and one of them's perfect, which one do you want to take a bite out of? The perfect apple. Which of these residues is more nutritious or palatable for the microbes? probably the one on the right. So what we think happened here, if you crisp it so fast, it just doesn't degrade as well because you've changed it. It's not as easy for the microbes to go after. So that's why we think the ATS is delaying that residue decomposition versus the no ATS. The other thing we learned in the second year with the clover, if you burn a crop within 24 hours, some of your herbicide maybe doesn't translocate to the growing point. We got lucky when we did the cereal rye. It terminated first time just fine. When we did the clover the next year, I can just tell you the ATS fried the tips too fast. The herbicide didn't translocate and the clover regrew. We actually had to terminate it again. So just a cautionary note for those that might think about adding ATS into a cover crop system, might need to separate from the herbicides based on which type of system you're working on. So then here's the effect of the biologicals though on the decomposition, and it's trending in the other direction now. In this case, the biologicals are having a positive benefit on enhancing that decomposition. So making progress on this side compared to the ATS. And so we can see that that residue decomposition is improving. So the ATS burns it, reduces the total decomposition, but the biologicals did increase the mid-season. That's really cool and all, and maybe we're tracking the nutrient release, but what's it really boiled down to at the end of the day is yield. So here is what we saw on the average across the two sites, the systems there. The cover crop was what we had a 6 bushel loss. Now I can tell you 2022 was dry for us. I seeded 75 pounds of cereal rye. 2023 was dry. I think this was probably a moisture issue. And the other thing you have to remember is I just told you I took a conventional system, full 3-pass tillage system, corn, soy, nothing in between, and said I'm going to take a no-till cover crop. Talk about a shock to the microbial system. So I would also think that we probably have a little bit of time for this to adapt. This is why it's a 4-year study and that we're tracking this 1 year at a time. So it was a 6 bushel loss. Oh, and then I forgot to mention, we also did a dry spread of AMS just to compare the dry versus the liquid. So here's the yield gains, and those in green there are from the cover crop. So this is doing all these practices on top of the cover crop, not compared to that control. And you notice in a few cases, those +6s we tied, but we had to pay to get there. So you paid for the seed, we paid for the input just to tie the no cover crop. But it showed some promise, especially like I said, the first year. But really what's going on here is it's sulfur response. So it goes back to the other original continuous corn. The biological alone had activity in season. You can see we got 2 bushels to the microbial blend, but by and large, fertility and nutrition is driving the residue cycling over these high residue systems, helping you overcome that. Because if you're high yield, it's maybe just a fertilizer effect that we're looking at. So that was exciting though. That's the first year what we saw. What about the second year? And you can see just again some of the logistics. We are going with the bare backgrounds. We had an Asgrow bean, now we have a DeKalb hybrid out here. We were a little later on this year's harvest, so we actually seeded this year's cereal rye early November. But again, you can see that site characteristics, what's going through time. There's the clover cover crop. One thing beautiful about working with clover is you bring your mom out there on a nice spring day and she loves it. It's a great opportunity for her. The tillage radish did die for us. We had a Halloween frost event that killed the tillage radish. So in the springtime, we only had the clover left, but it did overwinter. I know there's challenges with overwintering clover, and we were successful on that. Again, we saw the same trend of the chopping, giving us slightly less cover crop biomass. I can tell you, though, in both years, if you separate the chopping and the standard out, the penalty was less on the chopped residues because there wasn't as much biomass. So from a penalty perspective, sizing the residue is actually giving us an improvement because of that lower biomass. Again, there's a lot of value in the clover. We had almost 92 pounds of nitrogen, 24 pounds of P2O5, and then 130 pounds of K2O. But again, that's in early May when we terminated. I'm trying to get as much of that to release before August when we start really getting into grain fill. There's our total corn nutrient needs. So 230 bushel corn crop needs 256 pounds of N, 100 pounds of P2O5, 180 K2O. If I got all of that nutrients to release from the cover crop, that's the percentage of our fertility plan we might be able to rely on. That's the goal here. There is the decomposition again on the ATS, the same thing. We burned it, not as palatable. The microbes break it down at a slower rate. And then the microbial blends, actually in this case, were also backwards. So you buy the product that's supposed to increase the decomposition. And in this case, the highest decomposition was just not doing anything at all, letting the native microbes do their own thing. So just year to year, we're going one at a time, but it's goes back to the whole biological market. There's a lot of unknowns. So one year we get positive, one year maybe slight negative. But how does that relate to yields is the ultimate question. Or this question as well. Maybe they're not acting on the surface residues. Maybe they're working down to the soil and working on your organic matter or your smaller residue pieces. We don't know that as well. I mean, I spray the residues. I hope these products get into the residue. But what if they bypass the residue and go straight into the soil, and that's where they're having their activity? So it also just ideal thinking, this is what the products are marketed to do, but could they be doing something else? That's a question we don't necessarily know the answer to. We lost 11 bushels on that cover crop with the clover. It did get to 2 tons. Like I said, 2 years, we got 2 to go. We're optimistic we'll start to manage that through. But what happens when you do start to manage a cover crop? Because remember, that 11 bushel loss is me doing nothing different, just planting into it and treating it the same as I do the on-cover crop control. Here's the response to management. The broadcast AMS was really good. I can tell you it was 17 bushels on the standard and 20 bushels on the chopped. So the averages are what I'm showing here. There are some trends that pop out. So sulfur is having the greatest effect in the background. The dry AMS was pretty good. But the interesting thing goes back to where I started on the continuous corn. Those are additive. 7 plus 4 is 11, right? Or 1 plus 7 there is 8. So the microbe plus the fertility is additive. But if you had to pick one, fertility is getting us the bigger return in the beginning. So systems approach. The other thing that's interesting on that AMS, we applied the year before and this year. So now we've put out 40 pounds of sulfur 2 years in a row. Maybe it's just simply we're building the sulfur program up, and that's going to continue to grow higher and higher. So that's why I like these static plot studies too, because it's what happens year over year after you do the same thing as the system starts to adapt. And what's exciting is we've now surpassed the penalty. We actually had an 8 bushel or 7 bushel advantage over no cover crops. So making cover crops a little more manageable is the whole point here in residue. And we think that's really getting the biology of our soils to just help adapt and go through that. So in summary on these trial results, cover crops can be managed at termination. We've seen in 1 year on cereal rye enhance the breakdown, but in both years it did minimize the penalty. The nitrogen sulfur currently is the best approach that we're seeing for the biggest bang for your buck. I do caution on the herbicide compatibility. We do see some benefit to biologicals, but by and large, we see it's on top of supplemental fertility. It's not going to replace fertility. And I have a few key notes on residue management in general. I showed you the nutritional value, the treasure value of the residue, which is really, really cool and exciting. But if you enhance the decomposition and the nutrient release, you're accelerating the whole system. If that gives you higher yields, you also have higher removal rates. And over time, we have to be careful that we don't mine the soils, because I know there's a lot of phosphorus in our soils, right? There's the bank of unavailable, the bank of exchangeable, and the bank of available, and we keep restocking and refueling that. But those banks are in those proportions for some reason. And so if we try and drain the big bank, I mean, eventually it wants to go back to what it knows. So my approach to residue management is it's helping enhance the system, the turnover, the release of those nutrients. But if you're increasing the yields, you're increasing the removals. So I don't think they're a replacement for good base fertility management. However you're getting there, whether it's through manure or soil test VRT or blanket rates, but however you're doing your fertility program needs to still be considered. Residue management is not going to replace that need, is my honest opinion today. So with that, thank you very much for having me. I think we've got about 7 minutes or so for questions. So and we do try in our spare time, if there ever is any, to update our website, but yes. So the question is on the cover crop studies, when are we putting those treatments out? At termination. So the first year was 3rd week of April. The second year was, I think, May 1st. So those are springtime applications on that work, yes. What's in the microbial blend? So in that one specifically, there was, I think, 5 or 6 bacillus, and then a little bit of fungi in there as well. So we, like I said, we picked one that represented the market. Too many slides. But for those that are curious, we're almost there. There they are. So those are that's the species we had in this mix. So the source of sugar, this is a great question. So Neovita 43 is corn syrup based. We're putting out 1 gallon, it's about 4.5 pounds of sugar. And then our humic acid, we're doing 1 gallon to the acre of hydrohume. I should have clarified that. So I do like, you know what you call it when you apply corn syrup to grow more corn? That's cornablism. So hydrohume does not. So hydrohume is just leonardite-based humic acid, so mineral-based humic acid. Hydrohume, you got to be careful. There's like 16 different versions of it out there. We're using the 000 or the 001. Sorry. So they have a spike of 1% potassium, but at a 1 gallon rate, that I exclude the value of that. So could the sugar be molasses? Yeah, so you could use molasses-based sugars. Those are out there. I have worked with those in the past. They foam and bubble. So the one thing I've learned on the molasses sugars is they're not as fun going through the system, but there's a lot of types of sugars. Sugarcane molasses, yeah. So, but I would plausible any sort of simple sugar is the key, whether it's glucose, fructose, sucrose-based as your actives. Yep. Question is, did we have a way to know if this stuff was alive? We did not. We're writing a commentary about that exact challenge. The regulatory space to the whole biological market is not defined. There are no guarantees today that a product is alive, and you're legally not allowed to test them because that's violating IP. So we were not able to check. We had activity. I can tell you, on-farm check is after you crack the jug, don't throw it all out. Leave a little bit in there, cap it, and if it bloats, something was alive. But was it the ones that were there or did it contaminate? That's a big question. There's a lot yet to be figured out in this space about what's on the jug versus in the jug and how do we confirm that? Yep. I do definitely caution though, if you work with one of these and you open it, empty it, or put a pinhole in the top, because I have had 3 products explode in the cabinet on me. So the other joke with biologicals is the worse it smells, the better it probably works. I won't be a test subject for that one, but yes. So the question is, was the sulfur actually residue decomposition or just a sulfur response? In the cover crop work, it's a sulfur response or some smaller residue cycling that we can't measure, but it's not the surface residues on the ATS. On the ammonium sulfate in our cover or in our continuous corn, we did see the corn stalks degrade better. So the ammonium sulfate, we have seen the corn stalks degraded actually over the winter. And I think that's because those were fall applied. We gave them all winter long to act on it. In this side, we're up against the springtime. So in this case, yes, it's sulfur is a management tool for residue, probably stimulating just sulfur response or something below surface residues. Yep. Yep, the old residues. And that's the cool thing doing the no-till work when you go out there and you see corn stalks. That's from this year, that's from last time, and those might be from 2 years ago. Yeah. So, yep, the question is a little bit of cereal rye could immobilize fall nitrogen from newer availability for that year. And that's the idea. Can we get that to release this year? I did have a great question come from somebody. If I release it this year, did I steal it from when it would have released 2 years down the road? Valid question. That goes back to my last point. If you are enhancing the turnover and release of these nutrients and what would have released in 2 years did release this year, you got to be ready to make sure that you don't short the crop 2 years down the road or 3 years down the road. So if you're doing residue management for the nutrients, keep in mind it's a long-term play and it's not replacing fertility. It's just moving it through the system at a faster rate. Yep. So what's the carbon ratio on soybean stubble? I should know this off the top of my head. It's less than corn. I will have to actually look that one up. I don't know that one off the top of my head at the moment. We have 30 to 1. 30 to 1 that when I, yep. That seems Very, very right. The only one thing interesting, we have done these types of treatments on soybean stubble, and then what's the corn response? And we're seeing nothing. So I don't know, there's something about the way that monocot and dicot, maybe it's the calcium, the way those residues form. I will say we're seeing best success on our corn stalks or our silari, our soybean stubble, where we treat the stubble and then look at the corn, nothing. So that I don't have an answer for. But we are seeing better efficacy on the corn residues, those higher seed N ratios. Yep.
You're cycling nutrients faster. Are they likely to be lost quicker through tile drains or surface?
The question is, if we enhance the release, they got to go somewhere. And are they just leaching into the soil profile? Are we lost? Are we guaranteeing that what we release, we take up? Good question. We don't have the tile outlets or, deep core soil sampling to track if we've done that. Maybe our 1 foot cores that we're going on the 4-inch spacing will show if we're moving them down a little bit. But plausible. Now we're hoping if it's released in the root zone in that year, it's taken up immediately. And I'm plausible, or what I would hypothesize, my yield gains is hopefully because that's where the nutrition is coming from. But there is the risk, if you release more than we're using at a certain time, and then you get a 3-inch flushing rain, where's it go?